Thank you for joining us for today's message. We believe we can go anywhere in the world from right here in Marque, Texas, and reach people just like you. If you'd like more information about Abundant Life, please visit ALCC.org. You can also text the number below if you would like to support the church financially. Be ready for a powerful message that's going to impact your life.
I turn to the book of Genesis. Go ahead and be seated tonight and turn to Genesis chapter 15. And we're going to jump straight into this evening. And I think I got a word for you this evening. I think I've got something that hopefully will make sense to you. It's made sense to me this week. And it says in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 2, it says, "And Abram said to God," he said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Look," he said, "you have given me no children." And he said, "And a servant of my household is going to be my heir." So let me give you some context of what's going on here. Abraham had been given a promise from God, okay? So God had promised Abraham 15 years before this, God had promised him that he was going to have a child, all right? He was going to have a son, and this is at age 70. So can you imagine, I don't know if anybody in here is 70, but if you're 70 years old, like God speaks to you and says, "Hey, you're going to have a child." And you'd be like, "Are you sure you're talking to the right person," right? Like you'd be looking around. So Abraham and his wife Sarah hadn't had any children. He's 70, she's 60, and God says you're going to have a child. And so Abraham has this promise, but he doesn't have anything happening. All right, he doesn't have an answer, he just has a promise. And I think that's important because a lot of times we have expectations of good things. We can hear it, but how many of y'all know there's a difference between hearing and believing? Right? You can hear something all day long, but until you believe it, then what you hear doesn't really work in your life. I can hear a bunch of stuff, but until I believe what I hear, just hearing is really worthless in our world. And so Abraham not only heard, but he began to believe, and he had an expectation. He expected that he was going to have a child. He expected at age 70. He expected at 71, at 72, at 73, at 75, at 80, at 81, 82, 84, 85. He's like, "God, where are you?" And that's what we read in Genesis chapter 15. He said, "God, where are you?" He said, "Can't you see what I'm going through here?" He said, "You promised me something 15 years ago and it hadn't happened." He had an expectation. Look, expectation in your life can either be your greatest friend or your worst enemy. It can either be the greatest thing in your life. It can either be the thing that holds on to you, that keeps you where you need to be and holds on to that promise, or your expectation can be your greatest enemy. It can be the most feared foe in your life. Why? Because expectations that are unrealized, that are not met, always breed disappointment. They will always breed disappointment, which will lead to anger, which will lead to bitterness, which will lead to hatred. Unrealized expectations can destroy you. So watch, your expectation can either be your greatest friend or it can be your greatest enemy. An expectation used correctly can prepare us for the blessing. It can prepare us for what God has available for us. And that's where Abraham was. You see, faith in our life, faith is the reality, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's the reality of our expectation. Faith is what we expect to happen. And so when we have faith, when we have belief, we believe that God is going to do something. The thing is what happens if God doesn't do it the way we expect him to, or when we expect him to? Because a lot of times that happens. I don't know if it's maybe just in my life or maybe you've experienced that, but you felt like God said this is going to happen and then it didn't happen. And you're thinking, man, did I miss it? Did God miss it? Like, which one of us is wrong? But the reality is watch, our timetable is not God's timetable. Our desires are met by God, but not on our terms. I wish they were on our terms. I wish that God would do everything that I ever wanted him to do when I wanted him to do it, but that's not how it works. And Abraham's proof of that. And so we have Abraham, and he expected God to do something. And you can expect the best, or you can expect the worst. And I don't know if you're like me, but have you ever gone into a meeting with somebody and been expecting that it was going to go bad? You ever go into, you go into the house and you hear your kids screaming and you're expecting it to be bad, but you go in and they're screaming because they're having fun and everything changes. Watch, our expectation, our mind has a defense mechanism built in. Our mind has the ability in a millisecond to run through every possible scenario. And then what we do is we begin to focus in on the scenario to us that makes the most sense. Oftentimes, it's the negative scenario. Why? Because we're preparing ourselves, preparing our mind for a bad situation so that we will figure out a way to get out of it. Rarely, and again, maybe I'm the anomaly here, but rarely do I expect the very best. I try to, I force myself to, but naturally, my mind wants to go to what's the worst that can happen and how will I get myself out of this? And I'm probably the only one like that. You're probably never had that happen. Or maybe you got to go to a customer's house and you knock on the door and there's a giant dog barking at you and you're thinking, my God, when they open that door, that dog is going to come out and kill me. And then they open the door and the dog comes out and it starts licking your hand. Because it's a big old mean looking dog, but it's the friendliest dog in the world. I don't know if you've had that situation. But watch, we always expect there's something bad. That's how I am. And so here we go that Abraham is expecting something. And the worst thing we can do in our life is expect the worst. The worst thing we can do is expect the negative. Look for the negative. Because the reality is negatives are all around us, right? Negatives are everywhere. It's always going to be easy to find a bad situation. Always going to be easy to find a difficult path. Negatives are there. But here's the deal. It's like if you'd fallen out of a cruise ship, right? If you ever go on a cruise again and you fall out of the ship and you've got ocean all around you, but somebody takes one of those little like donut life raft things and they throw it into the ocean. What you can do is you can look at all the water around you and say, that's going to kill me, that's going to kill me, that's going to kill me, that's going to kill me. Or what are you going to look for? You're going to look for the float. You're going to look for the donut. Why? Because that's the one positive thing in an ocean of danger. And that's the thing that we have to force ourselves to do. That as believers is what God has equipped us to do, is find the life raft in the midst of a world that's trying to kill us, in the midst of a world that's trying to destroy us, that's trying to hurt us. And if we can find the good in the midst of the bad, then we are thinking like God thinks. Because that's what faith is. That's what God does. God finds good. God makes a way where there seems to be no way. God turns graves into gardens. God turns mourning into dancing. God turns dry bones into living armies. Why? Because God can make good out of bad. And Abraham was in a bad situation. All he saw was the bad. All he saw was the danger. All he saw was the hurt of 15 years of believing, 15 years of hoping, 15 years of begging and not receiving anything. Look, a rose bush is full of thorns, but the flower is worth the risk. The bloom is worth the risk. So what do? We pick the roses and we deal with the thorns because the flower's worth it. What in your life is worth the risk? What in your life is worth the risk to step out in faith, to believe a little bit longer, to hope a little bit harder? Is it your family? Is it your marriage? Is it your job? Is it your children? What in your life is worth holding on to a promise from God, saying, I don't see it, I don't feel it, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I trust. You see, that's where Abraham was. Abraham was in a deep, dark situation. He was afraid. And he understood that there was something worth holding on to. Watch this. You have to hold on to your belief in the midst of the struggle. I was typing that out the other day on my iPad, typing it out, and I wrote, you have to hold on to your belief in the midst of struggle. And it was interesting because my iPad auto-corrected the word midst, M-I-D-S-T, I must have spelled it wrong, but it auto-corrected it to dust, which is stupid. Because I was like, why would you think I'm saying the dust when I want to say the midst. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, who in the world would say you've got to hold on to your belief in the dust? I was like, man, this is dumb. And 99.9% of the times, you know what I would do? I would take and I would go delete, and I would type the right word in. But for just a split second, I stopped. And I looked down and I said, you have to hold on to your belief in the dust. And I was like, man, that kind of actually makes a little bit of sense. And you're thinking, no, it doesn't. Like, in the midst makes sense, but in the dust, what are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense. But I was thinking about this and I was like, man, you have to hold on to your belief in the dust. So I went to my Bible and I searched the word dust. Because I was like, man, I want to see what the Bible says about dust. Because if my iPad has any kind of spirituality, maybe it auto-corrected to something that would make sense, like with the Bible, right? And so I searched for the word dust. And we're talking about Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, right? The third thing that happened on my list was Genesis chapter 13. 2 chapters before this. And this is what it says. It says in verse 14. This is my iPad preaching my message for me. Watch this. And the Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north, the south, the east, and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So that anyone who could count the dust, then your offspring could also be counted. Go and walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I'm giving it to you. I thought that was kind of strange, right? That God would say to Abraham, I'm going to make your offspring like the dust. Okay, so now we got a little correlation, but it doesn't make sense that you have to hold on to your belief in the dust. Right, but God had told him your offspring are going to be like the dust of the land. And if you can count the dust, you can count your offspring. So he's telling him, not only will you have a son, but you're going to have a son who will have sons, and those sons will have sons, and those sons will have sons, and it will go generation to generation, year to year, decade to decade, century to century, millennium to millennium, and your offspring will be counted as if it were dust on the ground. But I didn't stop right there, because now I'm thinking, because he spoke to him and he said, everywhere that you go, all this land you will touch, it's going to be your land, and your offspring will hold this land, and you won't be able to count your offspring. And I'm thinking to myself, I was thinking, man, God, why would Abraham have to hold on to his faith, right? Because we're talking about Genesis 15. Where Abraham calls out to God and he says, God, are you even here? Do you even know my situation? Are you even paying attention? And Abraham's calling out to God. So I'm like, man, why would he be doing that when God, 2 chapters before, 15 years before, told him your offspring is going to be like the dust? And he's got this great promise, right? But this promise was made 15 years before. And Abraham was getting older. His wife was getting older. He didn't see any natural way for this to happen. It didn't make sense to him. And he's thinking, God, when are you going to do this? He said, look, this is 15 years. But watch this. That's why, in my opinion, this is why it's hard to hold on to our belief in the dust. Now, I was saying midst, but my thing corrected to dust. Now watch, this is going to make sense. Because what is dust? I was thinking about dust. What is dust? Dust is old skin. Say most dust in your house is made up of old skin cells, of old dead bugs, of old pieces of fiber and cloth off of your clothes, of old pieces of plastic. Dust is made up of all of this old stuff, the things from the past, the things that were, the things that could have been, the missed opportunities, the chances you never took. And so I was thinking about Abraham, and I was thinking about dust, and I was thinking, man, maybe Abraham was thinking, man, my life is covered in dust. It's covered with all of the missed opportunities that I had, all of the chances that I didn't take, all of the years that I prayed and I cried and I hoped, and I'm covered in the dust of my own failure. The dust of my unanswered prayer, the dust of my unrealized expectation, all the years of accumulated disappointment. And he said, God, where are you? You see, it's easy in our lives to be choked up, coated with. It's easy to be covered with yesterday's failures, yesterday's missed opportunities, yesterday's chances that we never took. And so what do? We buy into the idea that this dust is gonna cover us, that this dust is what's gonna hold us back. That yesterday, watch this, that yesterday has any effect on tomorrow. Now watch, yesterday in the natural, yes, it can affect your tomorrow. You made a terrible decision yesterday, that can affect what you can do tomorrow. But watch, in the kingdom of God, your yesterday does not destroy your tomorrow. Because God has the ability to change your future. And your future is not dependent on your past, it's dependent on what you do right here and right now. Because God has the ability to break the natural laws of this world. He has the ability to wipe away your dust. And Abram was coated with what he perceived as missed opportunities. He was coated by what he perceived as unfulfilled expectations and what God told him he would do, but he didn't see it happen. You see, I've noticed in my life that faith is easier to have in a battle than it is in the waiting time. It's easy to believe when you're under attack because something's happening. You can see the threat in front of you. But watch, when you're waiting for something to happen, when you're waiting on God, it's easy to get disappointed because you don't see anything happening. It's like if you plant a plant in the ground, if you put a seed in the ground, it's easy. Once that seed breaks the soil, you can look at it and you can daily see that it's making progress. But it's not about once it breaks the soil, it's about all the time that it was working downward so that it could come upward. You see, that's the reality of the kingdom of God. God is more about growing in you than he is growing out of you. Because once he grows on the inside of you, eventually what he has put in you, the root that he has put in you, will bear the fruit that you've been believing for. But God first must build in you before he can build out of you. And that's where Abraham was. He was in the waiting time. And God speaks to him in Genesis 15, verse 1. And it says, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And he said, do not be afraid, Abram. So this is right before what we read earlier. Do not be afraid. He says, for I am your shield and your very great reward. God's telling him, he say, man, don't be afraid. He said, I am your protection. I am your provision. I am the thing that guards you and the thing that blesses you. He said, I'm everything that you would ever need. Don't be afraid. Hit your neighbor, say, don't be afraid. Look at the person 2 rows back, because that's where they got to sit and say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Shout to somebody 6 feet away, don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid, God said, because watch, I am with you. I'm your shield. He said, I'm your provision. He said, I am the thing that will protect you. He said, the reward that you have will be very great. He's saying, don't be afraid. I have you. He's saying, man, I'm everything that you would need. What more would you ever need? And watch, Abraham says, but God. He says, what can you give me? God just told him, I'm everything. What do you want? I'm there. I'm it. I am everything that you would need. But Abraham said, what are you going to give me? That happened to us last night. Our daughter said, I'm hungry. My wife listed off 40 different things that she could eat, I promise. Good stuff. Like, it wasn't like you can have broccoli and green beans and squash. She was like, we got Oreos, we got macaroni and cheese, we got chicken, we got cereal, we got oatmeal, you can, 40 things, easy. She was like, I don't know. She's like, Dad, what can I have? I was like, well, your mom just told you can have whatever you want. What do you want? Anything in this house, you can have it. She was like, yeah, I just don't know if we have any food. I was like, what are you talking about? We have all the food. She was like, what about, do we have McDonald's? I was like, get out of here. We don't have McDonald's. But watch, we just told her you can have anything. But she was like, what are you going to give me? What are you going to make for me for dinner? And look, isn't that somehow the way we treat God? That's the way Abraham treated God. God said, I'm everything. And he said, yeah, but God, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to give me, man? He said, what will you give me because I remain childless? And the one who's going to inherit my estate, the one who's going to get everything that you've blessed me with, all that I've worked for, is a servant in my house. God, because you didn't give me a son. He just told him, I'm everything. And Abraham said, nah, what are you going to give me? I don't have anything. He's telling God, God, I know you're strong. I know you're my protection. I know you're all great, but I know you've given me all this stuff. I know that I've got money and I got a place to stay and I got all this great stuff, but I'm unfulfilled. The one thing I really want, it feels like you've been holding it back. And that's where Abraham is. He's in a tough place. He says, I hear the words, I heard your promise, but I don't see anything. Show me the money. But he already had the money, so he wasn't really saying that. But he said, look, man, I know. He said, your promise is there, but where is the answer? I'm not seeing you move. I'm not seeing you work. I don't see you. Where are you in my situation? He's crying out, calling out to God, saying, God, I don't see you. You're not here. But I love this. I love this story so much. I love that it says something so great about God. Because Abraham's crying out saying, God, where are you? Abraham's crying out, doubting God, disappointed with God, probably angry with God if we're being real. He's upset and he's hurt. But watch this, in verse 6, it says that he believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. So how did he get from God, where are you? God, are you even here? God, do you listen to me? God, are you ever going to do anything for me? How did he get from that, which seems to me like a pretty big jump, from saying, God, are you even there, to, hey, I believe and it's counted to me as righteousness. Now, righteousness in this day, that was hard to achieve. For God to say that, that was a big deal. But Abraham must have done something. But this tells me something about God. Because watch, Abraham doubted, he was afraid, he questioned, but God still had a plan to use his life. God said, look, I know you've got questions, I know you've got doubts, I know you've got fears, I know you wonder, but God says I can still do great things in your life. That gives me hope, because sometimes I doubt. Sometimes I fear, sometimes I wonder, sometimes I question God. God, are you even listening? But I love it because this tells me that God can still use me. God can still use you. You may be afraid, but God can still use you. You may question, but God can still use you. God still has a plan for your life. So how? How did he get from I'm doubting God to I believe in God? What flipped the switch in his life? Verse 5, the word of the Lord came to him. He said, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh. It's the first time God says it like that. It's the first time that God says a son who will be your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And then I love this, watch. It says, and he took him outside. He brought him outside. And that doesn't look very substantial. You're like, so what, he brought him outside? That's great. But for him to bring him outside, that means that Abraham would have had to be inside. That he was inside his tent when him and God were having this conversation. He was inside the room when he was talking with God, yelling to God, God, can you hear me? God, can you see me? Abraham said to God, look, God, don't you recognize that I have nothing? He was sitting in his room, staring at his wall, saying, God, look at my situation. He was surrounded by four walls, surrounded and covered with yesterday's dust, yesterday's disappointment, yesterday's unrealized expectation, and it was covering him. And he was looking at the wall 6 inches in front of his face, staring at it, saying, God, can't you see that I don't have a son? But what did God do? God says, oh, no. He said, Eliezer will not be your heir. He said, a son, your own flesh and blood, not an adopted son, not somebody I'm going to just bring in. Your child will be your heir. And it says that God grabbed him and brought him outside. Oh, I think that's going to make somebody make a lot of sense to you in a second. Because God got him out of his own way. Abraham was staring at four walls, and I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but look, when we have been in a world in the last 2 months where they have told you stay inside, stay out of outside, be in your house, watch your TV, stay inside. I got so sick of looking at the four walls of my house. I got so sick of just being in. I had to go outside. I had to step out and watch this. Maybe you've been sitting in your house looking at God saying, God, can you even hear me? God, are you even there? God, do you see this? Maybe you've been looking at your kids' homework saying, I don't know how to do this. God, how do I do this? Maybe you've been in a situation where that is your life. Watching the news saying, God, can you hear me? And Abraham was in this situation. Here was a man that was boxed in, not just by his surroundings, but by his history, by his issues, by his unrealized expectations. Abraham was boxed in, and God took him by the hand and drug him outside. He said, no, I got to change your perspective. I've got to change your expectation. I have to change the way you see. God says, because I can see, but until you can see. He said, if all you're doing, Abraham, is looking at your situation 6 inches in front of you, telling you how bad it is, telling you how it's never going to work, telling you how you need to be afraid, he said, until you rise above that situation, until you change your perspective, you're never going to get it. And the Bible says that he brought him outside. Look, every one of us in this world right now, we are dealing with things in 2020 that we never thought we would have to deal with. Every person has had their world flipped upside down. Every person is having to readjust how you live, how you act, how you react, what you do with your kids, what you do with your parents. Every person is having to deal with things that we were unprepared to deal with. If you would have told me the world would be like this 6 months ago, I would have laughed in your face and called you crazy. I'd have said there's no way it would ever happen. But this is the world we're living in. This is what has happened. And watch this. We are all dealing with things we've never faced before, doing things we never thought we would have to do. But there is good news. The good news is God is with us. The good news is God will never forsake us, that God will never leave us. The good news is that God's promise is still alive on the inside of us. The promise of God will never be late, it never expires, and it will never go unfulfilled. If God said it was going to happen, you can count on it happening. I started this year out saying it was going to be the greatest year of my life so far. I'll be real with you, it hadn't been that way yet. But you know what? There's still time. We're just a couple months in. Look, 6, 7 great months, and we won't even remember how crazy this was. Watch this. God has the ability to flip it in an instant. And Abram was in a spot, and he said, God, what do I do? And watch this. God pulled him out of his situation. God brought him outside. God was not surprised by coronavirus. God is not surprised by quarantines and shelter in place. God is not surprised with the stock market tumbling. God was not surprised when you got laid off of your job. God was not surprised. God has a plan. God has a purpose for you. God's got a destiny for you that's even greater than you imagine. You say, God, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but God has a plan. And he's got a way out of this for you. And he's got a purpose for you. And all you have to do is hold on to that faith. All you have to do is believe and trust, even in the midst of nothing making sense. Abraham was in a place where nothing made sense. But God has the unique ability to turn a bad situation into an incredible opportunity. And that's what I'm believing in your life. That's what I'm believing in your family. That's what I'm believing in your household. That's what I'm believing in your finances. That's what I'm believing in your health, that God is going to take a bad situation and he is going to flip the script on the enemy and something good is going to happen. Abraham believed in the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. If you can believe, anything is possible. If you can hope, anything can happen. But you've got to hope. You've got to hold on to that belief. You've got to hold on to the promise. God promised us this was going to be a good year. So we've got to change our perspective. If we can shift our vision and stop looking at what is, stop listening to what could be, and if we can see it for what it is, and it is God has a plan, God has a purpose, and we're going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You're going to make it through this. You're going to be better on the other side if you can shift your perspective and rise above the insanity of this world. And that's in any situation. That's in every situation. If you can rise above, I'm telling you, God can do something great in your life. But you've got to get out of your situation. You've got to get yourself spiritually, mentally, physically, whatever you got to do. If that means you got to walk outside at nighttime and just stare up at the stars, because that's what God told Abraham to do. He drug him outside and he says, Abraham, look at the stars. Because Abraham had been crying out to God saying, God, look at what I see. Look 6 inches in front of my face at the wall in my tent. And God says, no, you're seeing it wrong. He says, you look. And he brought him outside. And he said, count the stars. Abraham said, I can't count those. God said, that is what's going to be your offspring. Look at the dust on the ground. That is your offspring. Look, God is saying to you tonight, count the stars. God has a purpose for your life that's so much greater. I believe this so much greater than you can even imagine. You may say, nah, you don't know me. You don't know my situation. I don't, but God does. And I believe God's got a plan for you. I believe God's got a purpose for you. But it's going to require you doing something by faith that may feel a little strange sometimes, but you've got to step out of your situation. Look at your situation through somebody else's eyes. Force yourself to rise above the waves of the world. Stop looking at all the water around you and find the float that God's trying to use to save you. Whatever it is you're dealing with, whatever your situation, whatever your circumstance tonight, I believe God's got a plan. I believe He's got a purpose for you, and something is about to shift in your life. And I know it might be painful. I know it might hurt right now, but I believe that this is a word from God for somebody tonight, that if you can see the stars, if you can just step outside and say, man, God, if you can do that, imagine what you can do for me.
To learn more, visit walterhallam.net. Here you'll find a list of resources to help you with your daily walk in Christ.